Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Gamecore, and I like small handhelds. And this device here, which is called the Miyoo Mini, is indeed a small handheld. This device initially sold for about $40 or $50, and it almost immediately sold out. And for good reason, this is a really nice device for the price. It comes with a high-resolution 640 by 480 display, all packed into a 2.8-inch screen. On top of that, the case itself is of high quality, and it has some really nice buttons. So let's take a deep dive into the Miyoo Mini and see if this is the complete package. Without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, so let's start with some specs. This actually has a newish CPU with two Cortex A7 cores running at 1.2 GHz. Now it only has a 2D GPU and only 128 megabytes of RAM, but that higher spec CPU does provide for pretty good performance. The main draw here is the high resolution display, and while the company says it's IPS, the quality itself is actually kind of poor. We'll get into that more later. It comes with a 1900 mAh battery, which seems to give me about 4 to 5 hours of gameplay. Okay, let's do an unboxing. I got this device from keepretro.com as a review unit, and of course all opinions are my own and they're not seeing this video before I release it. The packaging itself is relatively simple and to the point. Inside you'll find a BitBoy branded sleeve for the device, as well as some basic instructions, just how to turn it on, exit the game, things like that. It also comes with a USB-C cable as well as a USB card reader. These readers are prone to failure, but it's nice to have them in the box. Okay, and the big reveal here. I got the DMG colored one here. I kind of like this color, it looks kind of old and washed out. First impressions, this thing is small. It's smaller than I was actually expecting, but it feels pretty nice and balanced in the hands. Let's check out the D-pad first. And this is actually a pretty good D-pad. It has a good rubber membrane connection to it, nice travel, good pivot. I have no complaints about this D-pad. Same thing with the face buttons. They're a little bit clicky, but also rubber membrane, good tactile feedback here. Let's mix things up here and go to the bottom next. So this is a 32 gigabyte SD card that comes with the device. It's loaded with the file structure as well as some Chinese games. Also below we have a USB-C charging port and a headphone jack. On the back we have shoulder and trigger buttons. These are clicky but well placed. I also like that the L2 and R2 stick out a little bit more than the shoulder buttons. It makes them easy to differentiate. Overall, I don't think they're that bad at all. They are clicky, but they also are nicely balanced with the overall controller itself. And like I said, it's really easy to tell the difference between the shoulder and trigger buttons, which makes gameplay that much better. On the left, we have a volume wheel. I'm a big fan of these, so kudos to the company for putting that in. And then up top, we have a power button and LED indicator. The start and select buttons are hard plastic and clicky, and they feel nice to press down on. Same thing with the function button. This is also clicky. It's a little bit more recessed than I would have liked, but it also means you're not going to touch it accidentally. Overall, the buttons and controls on this device are really high quality, especially at this price point. They did a really good job with this. Okay, a couple notes on the screen here. So this is 2.8 inches like I mentioned before, and the bezels on this are tiny. It's really impressive. Last note, on the back it has this DMG style ribbing, and then it also has a user replaceable battery. I'm a big fan of these as well. And while I haven't seen this exact battery offered for sale yet, it does look very similar to other similar batteries like the Samsung Galaxy 4 battery, so it may just be a matter of time before people figure out which replacement we can use for this. Okay, let's power this thing on and see what the user experience is like. Now this is a Linux-based operating system, and it takes about 12 seconds to boot up from start to finish. That's pretty good. Now this device comes with both stock standalone emulators as well as RetroArch inside, and we'll get into the details with that here in a minute. But overall, this is what the user interface looks like. You can choose between your game, which is your stock emulators, as well as RetroArch for the others. And within here, they have some pretty nice graphics that allow you to pick a system, and then theoretically you would pick your game after that. As you can see, they basically have all the major systems up to the PS1. Now, I'm not sure about your device, but mine came with a bunch of Chinese games on it. And maybe they're going to change this with future releases, but for now, it's kind of useless to a Western audience. But all the same, it does give you an indication of what the gameplay is going to be like. So for example, here I'm playing this random game, and once I'm done playing with it, all you have to do is press the function button, and it'll bring up an in-game menu. And within here, you can exit out of the game. And so that's how you get in and out of games with the stock emulators. Other things available is an app section which has some standalone games, and then there's also a settings function here which just has some very basic settings. Now if we jump into the RetroArch section, you can see that it has a front end for each of the cores, so you could theoretically open up a core and then pick your game and start playing it. But unfortunately none of the games are listed within any of these. Now one thing I really like about this device is that it has a universal power down system. All you have to do is push down on the power button for a couple seconds, and then it'll ask you if you want to shut down your device. And that's a really handy function that's often not seen in some of these handhelds. So let's grab that SD card and put it into our computer and see what kind of things we can find inside. Now this is a FAT32 formatted card and really just the file structure on the card here, so all you're really going to want to do if you want to back this up is just move all these files onto a new SD card that's formatted to FAT32. So within the ROMs folder, you're going to find a bunch of different systems, and digging into this, you can find there are subfolders, and then within that there are games. So the structure here seems to be fairly straightforward. And so all I'm really going to do is delete all these Chinese games and add my own here in a minute. Now this isn't the only ROMs folder. If you look, there's one called RROMs, and within here is the different RetroArch cores. And it's funny, but I think they expect you to put the games in each of these different folders, so you'd have to duplicate your game files. There's a fix for that, which I'll show here in a minute. But first, let me move over some game files. So I've already deleted out all the Chinese files from the system, and then I'm just moving over my own. And in some of these emulators, you could probably zip the files in order to save on space, but I'm just going to leave them as the unzipped original format. Now within the folder structure, there's also an images folder, and it looks like it has the same setup, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to grab a bunch of images and I'm going to drag them over as well. Biggest thing here is to make sure that the ROMs and the images have the same file name. Okay, so now that we've added the content to the standalone emulators, let's mess around with the RetroArch side and see if we can get that to play nicely as well. First thing you'll notice is that there's an RApp folder here, and this is actually going to contain all of your RetroArch cores. Now there is a backup folder called Buckup, and within here you can actually find other cores. So let's add a few of these to that main folder and see if these will actually work. Let's grab the 2 Super Nintendo cores as well as the one for ScumVM. And while we're in here, I can see that the MGBA core is here, but not GPSP. And sure enough, it's within the backup folder too, so I'm going to move that one over as well. And I'm just copying these over wholesale. So now let's try to point these cores to the folder that actually has all the game files in it. So I'm going to open up the NES core here, and as you can see, there's a config file at the top. Let's go ahead and open that up with Notepad and see what's inside. And sure enough, within here, it shows the ROM path. So what we need to do here is change this ROM path from where it expects to find it within the RetroArch folder, and move it over to that regular ROMs folder that we were just putting games into. So it's as simple as just renaming this file structure to show ROMs and then the name of the folder. Either way, that's basically how it works. So you can go into the RApp folder, find the name of the core that you want, like the Gambate core for Game Boy and Game Boy Color, and then open that up with a text file, and then change that folder structure within the ROM path to point to the actual place where all the ROMs are. And that's typically going to be the word ROMs with the uppercase R, and then you can find the folder with all the games in there. For me, it's the GB folder. And that's it. Now the RetroArch and the stock emulators are going to find the same files. Okay, so let's eject the SD card, put it back on our device, and see if it worked. We'll start with the RetroArch section, and sure enough, the cores that I adjusted are now all in here. I even took out a couple cores and put them into the backup folder so that they wouldn't show up here because I wasn't planning on using them. So it's pretty easy to configure this to whatever menu you want to have. And sure enough, when you go into any of the cores, you can actually find all the file systems, you can browse through and launch the games. So now, instead of using the standalone NES emulator, I'm actually using the NES core within RetroArch. Okay, let's get into the RetroArch menu and see what kind of configurations we can do. Just press the function button here, and as you can see, it's actually in Chinese. Let me show you how to change this system language. So press the B button to back out to the main menu, and then go down to the 5th menu choice, which is the settings section, and then select the second to last option. This is the user section, and within here at the bottom you can see our different language options. So now you can set it to Esperanto or Polish or English, whatever you'd like. Once you've adjusted those settings, go ahead and back out to the quick menu again, and then select Close Content, which is going to close that NES game. Now go into Configuration File, and then select Save Current Configuration. From now on, when you launch RetroArch, it's actually going to be in your preferred language. Okay, so now that we can actually read the menu, let's go into the settings section and go into video and see what kind of scaling options we have. And so theoretically here, we should turn on the integer scaling and then set an aspect ratio of 4:3, especially for NES games. But if you back out to the game and start it up again, you can see that actually none of those settings changed. And so unfortunately, that's the weird thing about this current RetroArch build. You can't actually make any settings changes anyway. So for example, you can't show the frame rate, or for Game Boy Advance games like this one, it doesn't actually show it at the correct 3:2 aspect ratio. It just blows up everything to be full screen. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to figure out a way to fix this in RetroArch. Even by going in and manually changing the config file within the file structure, it didn't make any change. No matter what settings I changed, it would still show a full screen like this. And that's going to be pretty frustrating, especially since RetroArch relies on tinkering like this. Now, some of these standalone emulators do actually allow you to make some settings changes. For example, the standalone Gambate emulator does have a native menu. So if you press the function button and then you select native menu, you can see the original standalone emulator's options. And from within here, there are a couple different scaling options. Now that being said, it doesn't look all that great, and the performance on here is actually worse than on the RetroArch core, so it's really going to be up to you. So for now, until they get better firmware, these are the options you're left with. Okay, since the size of this device is such an important factor in it, let's do a bunch of size comparisons here. And I'm just going to speed this up to double time and just kind of run through a bunch of different handheld systems that you might be interested in comparing them to. And I think at the end of the day, this is probably one of the most pocketable devices I've ever owned. It's not the smallest thing in the world, but in terms of the features and just the portability of it, it is a really good mix. This is definitely the type of device that you could slip in and out of your pocket with no problems at all. So I think in that sense, it's a big win. Now this Miyoo Mini weighs about 106 grams. That's a pretty lightweight system. It's about 20 grams lighter than its main competitor, the RG280V, and also lighter than the Powkiddy V90. Overall, this device is a really great mix of size and weight. Now let's do a quick comparison against the original BitBoy. Now the factory at Miyoo actually makes a bunch of different devices, including BitBoy and PocketCo devices, so this was made at the same factory, but a few years ago. And as you can see, they've made a lot of improvements over the years between these two devices. The Miyoo Mini just feels a lot more refined, whereas the BitBoy just feels very cheap and plasticky. As you can see, the D-pad and the face buttons are not rounded in any way, and they don't have any ornamentation to them. And so this BitBoy is really a testament to how much this company has grown when it comes to manufacturing these devices. And the Miyoo Mini is quite a feat in hardware engineering. It's really impressive for a little device like this. So let's jump into performance. I'm a little hesitant to show off performance here just because I do think that performance will improve as more people get their hands on it. There's already several developers who have been interested in upgrading this device. As it stands, I prefer to use the RetroArch cores despite not being able to change any of the settings. Overall, they just seem to play much better. When it comes down to it, the only systems that have any problems playing are going to be some of the harder to run Super Nintendo games, as well as Game Boy Advance and PS1. But overall, the performance is pretty good. Again, I'm using the RetroArch cores. These tend to have a little bit of audio crackling, but other than that, I really don't have any complaints. But it's definitely not perfect. If you're a huge Super Nintendo fan, you are going to have to make some compromises when it comes to performance. A good test of that is playing the intro music in Final Fantasy III on the Super Nintendo. So if you have audio issues in this intro, you typically are going to have performance issues later in the game. Let's have a listen here. So as you heard, it's not quite perfect. But I think when it comes to casual, pocket-friendly gameplay, this is a really good mix. This is going to be a great device for one-handed gameplay, especially for role-playing games like Final Fantasy III. But unfortunately, Chicken disagrees. She does not think this is good for one-handed gameplay. She prefers to use both paws. Moving on to other performance, arcade performance is actually pretty good on this. I think in particular, this one really excels with a lot of the classic retro games, things like Rampage or even Qbert. Now I did have some issues with some vertically oriented games like Zaxxon. It actually would show upside down, and unfortunately in RetroArch you're not able to change the settings, so some games may be broken. But overall I enjoyed the arcade gameplay on this system. In fact, it was one of my highlights when doing all my gameplay testing. It's pretty cool to have such a tiny little arcade system available in your pocket and no cord is required. For a quick D-pad test here, you can see I'm having no problems playing Street Fighter games, and that's a really good sign too. It is a little bit awkward to use the shoulder buttons, but otherwise fighting games are pretty good on this. Now PS1 is kind of a mixed bag and it takes some experimentation based on the game. In general, I do find that I like the RetroArch version better. It seems to be most consistent when it comes to full speed gameplay, but it will get bogged down with audio crackling and stuttering here and there. But you know, despite having a 2D GPU, it actually does 3D games pretty well. I would say don't buy this system specifically for PS1 games, but you might be surprised at how well some of these will play. My advice is to stick with role-playing games, because the slower pace of those might work the best with this performance. Now, not every system is going to work perfectly. For example, the ScumVM RetroArch core does crash after a few seconds, and this is probably a limitation of the 128 megabytes of RAM. Either way, across the board, I prefer to use RetroArch for almost all of my gameplay. Now, one of my favorite all-time small handhelds is the Anbernic RG280V, so I'm going to spend a few minutes comparing the two of these. The 280V is a little bit thicker than the Miyoo Mini and a little bit wider as well. They each have unique layouts when it comes to the shoulder buttons. But when it comes to ergonomics, I actually think the Miyoo Mini is more comfortable, and that's because it's more centered and not at the top of the device. It just feels like a more natural place to put your fingers. By contrast, the shoulder and triggers are at the top of the 280V, and it's a bit of a stretch to actually reach them. And to combat that, I've basically adapted my gameplay style to focus on games that don't really require shoulder buttons at all. And I found that that use case does make me enjoy the device a lot better. Now I want to spend some time comparing the screens on this device, but it requires one caveat first. And you're just going to have to trust me on this, but the screen that you're seeing on the video here looks a lot worse in real life. And that's because my camera seems to pick up on the colors on the screen a lot better than the human eye does. And so while this may look nice and colorful and vibrant, it's the opposite experience in real life. If anything, it feels like I'm playing this system while in a bunch of fog. The only way I can really describe it is that the screen itself is hazy. The best way I'm able to replicate that experience is actually turning this device to its side. And so at this angle right here is about as saturated as it's actually going to look in real life. And that's a far cry from what it looks like when you're looking at it head on. And so my point here is that even though these screens look pretty similar here in this video, it's actually night and day. The color saturation, contrast, as well as the deepness of the blacks are far and away better on almost every other device that I own compared to the Miyoo Mini. It's actually disappointingly bad. And it's ironic that I can't actually show you this here on the screen because they look so similar with the camera. Either way, as more people get this in their hands, I think that you're going to see similar feedback over time. Okay, with that out of the way, let's compare these screens. The first thing I noticed off the bat is that I actually like the color balance better on the Miyoo Mini than on the RG280V. The contrast of the blue and brown colors are very stark on the Miyoo, whereas on the 280V, everything has kind of a greenish tint to it. So while the 280V has much better brightness and clarity, the Miyoo Mini is actually a much more balanced looking screen. Now another thing to note is that the RG280V is a lower resolution. It's only 320 by 480, and even the 480 are half-height pixels. And so what that means is that naturally the resolution on the Miyoo Mini is just going to look a lot better with most other games. Here's Mega Man 10 running on the RetroArch, and as you can see the life bar on the left is fully balanced. I'm pretty sure it's running a bilinear filter here. It's hard to tell because I can't actually adjust the settings here in RetroArch. But here on the 280V, the only way to replicate that experience is to use a bicubic interpolation, which gives the pixels an overall harsh tone, especially compared to a higher resolution screen. That being said, the RG300X also has a 640 by 480 display. Now this is 3 inches instead of 2.8, but far and away this looks so much better than either of these two screens. This is really how to do a 640 by 480 display. Now you might be asking why I prefer to use RetroArch with the Miyoo Mini if I can't change the settings. Well, here's the standalone SNES emulator, and as you can see the scaling on this is just terrible. Look at that life bar. So for better or for worse, I prefer the screen on the RetroArch cores over the others. It is a little bit fuzzier looking because I do think it does have a bilinear filter, but all the same the scaling looks very nice. So in summary, the 280V is a little bit harsher of a display, and the RG300X in all ways is superior, but it's also almost twice the price. So at the end of the day, when it comes to overall scaling, the Miyoo Mini is actually really impressive. It doesn't have those harsh pixels like you find on the 280V, and it can almost stand toe-to-toe with the RG300X, despite being almost half the price. It also has a good color balance. The RG300X runs a little bit red, whereas the 280V runs a little bit green. The Miyoo Mini is a great balance between the two. Now one place where the Miyoo Mini falls short is the overall navigation of the user interface. I think the 128 megabytes of RAM prevent you from being able to scroll through the games quickly like you can on the 280V or the 300X. Not only that, the simple menu front end that is used on these devices running an Atom firmware image is just a joy to navigate. On top of that, you have various themes that you can use or make your own. By contrast, navigation on the Miyoo Mini is kind of clunky, and the images don't scale properly, so there's a lot of work to be done on this front end here. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. You can actually scroll through these games using the shoulder buttons to more quickly navigate through the systems, but all the same, it's nothing like compared with the RG280V. Okay, so now let's talk about ergonomics. When you're playing the Miyoo Mini, you're naturally going to want to put your first two fingers on the back of the device itself. And if you end up using any game that requires shoulder buttons, you're probably going to move those index fingers up on top of the shoulder buttons. So overall, there's quite a bit of room here to work with. And on top of that, because this device is a little bit taller, it does feel more balanced in the hand. That being said, it does feel less wide and a little bit squished when you're holding it with two hands. On the other hand, the 280V feels a little bit like holding a square. Same thing here, you're going to want to put your index and middle fingers on the back of the device, and I tend to naturally push my index fingers up towards kind of where the speaker resides, just so I have easier access to the shoulders and triggers when I need them. And because the device is ever so slightly wider than the Miyoo Mini, to me it does feel fairly comfortable too. It doesn't feel quite as cramped when I'm holding it. The cramping really comes in when I have to use the shoulder and trigger buttons. It's just quite a stretch to have to reach these. So naturally what I do is I end up reaching the shoulder buttons when I need them and then pulling them down when I'm not going to use them. And it's not something that I actively think about when I'm playing, but it is a movement that you're going to have to get used to. By contrast with the Miyoo Mini, your fingers are just going to naturally rest on those shoulder buttons. And so you don't have to do any sort of special movement to get to these buttons, your fingers are already there. And when it comes to comfort, that is a big deal. And like I said, the height of the device itself does make it a little bit more balanced feeling and centered when you're putting your thumbs on the face buttons and D-pad. That being said, the placement of the speaker is not ideal. It's very easy to cover it up with your thumb and mute the sound. So if someone was to hold a gun to my head and say, okay, which one is more comfortable, I'm going to go with the Miyoo Mini. But of course, comfort isn't the only thing to consider when it comes to a device. Let me show off a couple more examples. We'll start with the sleep function on the Miyoo Mini, and it's actually a very simple function. You just tap the power button and it goes to sleep. And that's all well and good, but right now, all that actually does is turn off the screen and the sound. For example, if it's running a cutscene and you put on sleep and then you come back to it later, the cutscene will have continued to play while the game was in sleep mode. And the conclusion I draw from that is that the sleep mode on this is basically useless because you're typically going to want to put this to sleep when you need to put the device down for a while. But if you can't trust it to actually go to sleep, then what's the point? It's going to drain your battery. Now the 280V does have an active sleep mode. You have to press the power button and the Y button together, and then tap the power button to bring it back from sleep. But this is what they call a deep sleep. It actually can be left on overnight like this. And for a portable and pocketable device, for me, sleep is a very big deal. You're going to want to get in and out of this device when you're like waiting in line at Jiffy Lube. And unfortunately, the Miyoo Mini falls short in that category. And the other point I want to make here is just how pickup and playable the 280V is compared to the Miyoo Mini. In both of these scenarios, I'm going to power on the system, I'm going to start up Super Metroid, and then I'm going to exit the game and then exit the system. And despite the fact that the Miyoo Mini actually boots up faster than the 280V, actually navigating to the game and then loading it up and closing it out and powering down is much faster on the 280V. And so keep in mind that community development is a big deal when it comes to these little handhelds. And yeah, the chipset on the 280V is over 10 years old at this point, but it's been used in retro handhelds since 2013. And the sheer amount of development that's happened for OpenDingX over the years means that it is a very optimized firmware. There's a lot more work to be done on the Miyoo Mini to get it to this level, and I'm not sure if there's going to be enough community interest to get to that level either. Okay, this has been a pretty long one, so let's wrap it up with what I like and what I don't like. Number one, I love the small form factor of this device. It is so easy to take in and out of your pockets. It also has impressively good controls for being such a budget handheld. I'm also a big fan of the volume wheel and just how easy it is to turn up and down the volume. And having a replaceable battery is a very user-friendly feature. If we can get our hands on additional batteries, that'll make this device really handy when it comes to travel. And at about $50, this has been priced really well. But on the other hand, based on demand, I've seen the price climb up to $70, $75 at this point. And finally, I really like how easy it is to power on and off this device. You just push the power button for a couple seconds and then confirm. Okay, so now let's talk about the things I don't like about the Miyoo Mini. And I probably made it very clear at this point, but I'm not a huge fan of this screen. I love the resolution, but it just has an overall hazy look to it. The clarity on this is probably the worst of any other handheld device that I own. I'm also not a fan of the speaker placement. I found that I had to adjust the angle of my thumb just to be able to hear games while I'm playing, and that's not ideal. And when it comes to PS1, Super Nintendo, and Game Boy performance, right now it's somewhat compromised. You have to basically fiddle between the different emulator options you have available. And while you also have to do that on the 280V, within the front end it gives you the option to actually save which emulator you want to boot with that game. And unfortunately that's not available here, so you're just going to have to memorize which emulator works best with which game. And even then, some of the games on these systems aren't going to run perfectly no matter which one you use. And that's because of my fourth point here. The current firmware needs a lot of work. Not just from the user interface perspective, which has all sorts of problems, but right now you can't configure RetroArch to actually make any sort of scaling changes. And I do think that some of these emulators can be optimized as well. Now I'm fairly certain that the community is going to improve this in a very short time frame, but all the same, I don't want to make any promises yet before it's actually been released. So for now, given its current state of firmware, do I still recommend this device? And yes, I do, because I do think that for this price point, you're getting a lot of bang for your buck. If they continue to sell this device at maybe $40 or $50, this is going to be the best price to performance that I've ever seen. And I hope that the enthusiasm behind this device is going to also result in improved firmware and just a better overall gaming experience. As it stands, this company did a great job when it comes to hardware. It basically checks all of my boxes when it comes to a small retro handheld. That being said, it does have some stiff competition. The Anbernic RG280V is also a very refined device, and it does take advantage of the Atom custom firmware image. This is going to give you some beautiful navigation options, the ability to create or just download different themes, and it boots in and out of games super quickly. And the RG300X also uses that same firmware image, but with a better screen than either of them. And sure, it's a fingerprint magnet, but it has some great features to it, including dual stereo speakers. Of course, this one costs quite a bit more than the others, but if you are looking for a pocketable handheld with great performance, then I think these three devices are going to be your best bet. And whether or not the Miyoo Mini is going to be a better fit for you is up in the air. Are you willing to take a gamble on future custom firmware, or are you just happy with how it looks today? Either way, I'm excited to hear what you think about it in the comments below. Let me know what you think of it. And as always, thanks for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. And we will see you next time. Happy gaming.